Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the final part of our webinar series on the importance of values. Today we will be focusing on the importance of societal values. My name is Margaret Kelsey and I'm the Director of Education and Training for the Barrett Value Center. It is my pleasure to be with you all today. And before we get to the content, I will briefly introduce Richard Barrett and let you know how we will be spending our time together. Richard is an internationally recognized thought leader on the evolution of human values in business and society. He's the founder and chairman of the Barrett Value Center, a fellow of the World Business Academy, and a former values coordinator at the World Bank. He is the author of several books, including The Values-Driven Organization, A New Psychology of Human Well-Being, and Evolutionary Coaching. His most recent book, Everything I Have Learned About Values, is the focus of our time together today. In this session, we'll start with a presentation by Richard that addresses many of the questions you posted about societal values when you registered. As additional questions come in, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will raise them and we'll introduce them at different points during the presentation. And we'll be answering them also at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard and hand it over to him.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. So, welcome everybody. Today is the last in the series. First one was on personal values, second on organization, third one on societal values. And I believe that you can catch up with any of the webinars that we've already done by going to our website, valuecenter.com. So without further ado, I'm going to start to my presentation. And these are the topics we're going to cover today. We may cover a few more topics, but these are the ones that I've designed the presentation around. Which are the most conscious nations on the planet? What is the worldview of your nation, and what is your worldview? Or how do you understand what your worldview is? So, first of all, let me explain that every human being grows in stages of psychological development. We discussed this in the first two webinars in a great detail in the first webinar. And every human being operates at levels of consciousness, 7 levels of consciousness. And they live inside a worldview which reflects the stage of collective psychological development that the community or nation they were born into has reached. So, okay, so if you're a particular age, you're at a particular stage of psychological development. No matter what stage you're at, if you suddenly lose all your money, etc., you will drop down to the survival level of consciousness. You don't drop down to that survival stage of development. You drop down to the survival level of consciousness. And you live inside a country which where the average worldview reflects to a large extent the average stage of psychological development of the people there. And worldviews in nations evolve as the people evolve. But, you know, I may be, in fact I do, I live in the United Kingdom, and the worldview of United Kingdom is something that I call world awareness. And I myself actually operate from a higher worldview. So there can be a distribution of worldviews of different people in a particular nation. So how do we get to our worldview? Well, we get to it from our belief systems. There are 3 belief systems that we all have. One is our personal belief system, one is our cultural belief system, and one is what I call our cosmology, our understanding of our current life and its relationship to other dimensions of existence. I mean to what happens to us when we die, for example. Now, each of these belief systems cover a different area of our lives. So our personal belief system is basically operates from moment to moment, and it governs our emotional life. So I may be talking to somebody and they then may call me a name, and immediately I react in the moment, and my emotional system kicks in, and that's my personal beliefs kick in. And our personal beliefs are the beliefs mostly that we learn between the moment we are born up to the age of about 24, when our mind brain is fully developed. We don't have a fully functioning mind brain until our mid-20s, and you know, I'm fond of saying this is why teenagers do really stupid things, because they don't have a fully developed neocortex. Now, the cultural belief system that we have covers our day-to-day living, and how do we find our place in the society that we live in so that we can get our needs met, okay? Now, our cosmological belief system, it covers a much bigger time frame. In fact, some ways it's eternal. If the cosmology that you have is transcendent, then it means that it covers your life in this three-dimensional material reality, but also in the fourth-dimensional energetic reality, the place we go to when we die. Well, what we believe we go to. So all cosmologies are transcendent, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Well, I'll explain it now. I already begun to, but when you look at different worldviews, each worldview has a particular cosmology, and in world awareness, which I'll describe in a moment, the cosmology is scientific. Now, in that cosmology, there is no God, there is no soul, and you know, life is basically based on Darwinian random mutations. Before world awareness, there came nation awareness, and that in that cosmology, mostly a monotheistic cosmology, our gods were external to us and we worshiped them. After the, and they were transcendent. After the scientific cosmology, we went into what I call people awareness. We went from world awareness to people awareness, and spirituality became the cosmology, and that's where we began to worship, in a sense, our internal God. So we went from an external to an internal, passing through a cosmology where there was no God at all. So I'll go into more detail on that in a moment. So here are the three belief systems that make up our worldview. And what a worldview is basically a set of lenses or beliefs which we use to interpret what's happening to us and to give meaning to what is happening to us. And it helps us to respond to what is going on so that we can get our needs met. In other words, we use our worldview for meaning making and decision making. Now, our worldviews include aspects of all three of these belief systems. And we normally use the belief system which is most pertinent to the situation we're experiencing in order to interpret and to respond to what is happening. So, for example, we'll use our cosmology to help us understand what's happening when somebody dies. We use our cultural belief system to help us to vote in an election. What needs do we feel need to be met in our culture? And we use our personal belief system to help us with our relationships. So we turn to these different belief systems which make our worldview for different aspects of our life. Now, so everybody has a worldview bias. So many people's worldview are dominated by one aspect of their belief system. If somebody has a difficult time in their childhood, they will develop subconscious fear-based beliefs, and they will tend to interpret everything that happens to them through their personal lens. They'll take it all personally, and so their personal belief system dominates. If you get through your childhood reasonably well, but your parents are discriminated against, or you're discriminated against, or you live in poverty, you will probably look at the world through your cultural belief system because you want to change what's happening in your community. And if you have developed a reasonable personal belief system without too much fear, if you didn't suffer too much through injustices or inequality in your cultural belief system, you may then move on to the cosmology as your main belief system. And so, for example, I've reached the ripe old age of 73. I tend to interpret what's happening mostly through my cosmological belief system. But what does Donald Trump do? Well, which worldview, which belief system dominates his worldview? Well, I happened to read Donald Trump's book on leadership, and from that I plotted his values, and I did this in the New Leadership Paradigm, which I published in 2010. So I actually have a map of Donald Trump's values based on levels of consciousness. So here you can see the levels of consciousness and the values that I found that Donald Trump espouses in his belief system. And he has 3 limiting values. These are the ones with an L, the white dots. There's image, revenge, and ruthlessness. And if you look at these 2 positive values, disciplined and winning, and revenge and ruthlessness, when you put them together, you don't want to mess with Donald Trump, because he's very disciplined about winning, and he will be revengeful, and he will be ruthless. So these 3 values are limiting values. You see where they're located at the first 3 levels of consciousness. And that, to a large extent, explains why Donald Trump is the way he is. He didn't get his survival needs met. He didn't get his love needs met. He didn't get his self-esteem needs met when he was young, at least sufficiently. So he's got some subconscious fear-based beliefs at those levels of consciousness, and therefore his worldview is highly dominated by his personal belief system. So basically, this is what I just said. If you have fears about not having enough to survive, or fears about abandonment, or you've got fears about not being loved or feeling safe, and feelings about beliefs about not being respected, then these become hardwired into your brain as you are growing up, and the personal belief system will dominate your worldview. So let's just stop there for the moment, see if there's any questions. So over to you, Margaret. Any questions for the moment?
Yeah. Do you want to come back on, Richard? So
sure.
Of the belief systems we have, then, is there one that is strongest or more influential in our worldviews, or are they related to psychological growth and what you just touched upon with, limiting beliefs, limiting experiences?
Okay, so every person is different on this, and their worldview may change as they go through the seasons of their life. Basically, if you didn't get a higher education, or you didn't travel very much, you always stayed in the same community roughly, then your belief system will tend to reflect the lower stages of psychological development, because you never got a chance to individuate. So your belief system will tend to be, your personal belief system will tend to dominate your worldview. If, on the other hand, you did manage to leave the company you were brought up in, you traveled the world, you got an education, you lived in different places and different countries, you will probably have individuated. That means you move through the 4th stage of development, and you begin to ask yourself the question, well, this is the worldview I grew up in, but actually these other worldviews that I'm encountering as I travel around, actually I quite like them. And so you begin then the individuation process, which can lead eventually to self-actualization and higher stages of development. So, everybody's on that journey, and basically where a person is in terms of their stage of psychological development will, to a large extent, determine their worldview.
Gotcha. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And so how then my worldviews, and one of the questions we have here is, how do you start the change of a culture of a society based on worldviews? Like, what are the best levers for creating change?
Well, see, the worldview of a nation or of a community is a reflection of the average level of consciousness, which is a reflection of the stage of psychological development, the average level of stage of psychological development that the people in that community or nation are at. So if you want a community or a nation to evolve and in their worldviews, then people need to learn how to individuate. That's the fourth stage of psychological development. We all go through the first three stages up to the age of 24 normally. We learn how to survive, we learn how to conform, and we learn how to get respect, or we don't. But these are the respect and recognition usually is very important in our teenage years. Feeling loved is very important from the age of about 3 to 8, and learning how to survive and is very important in the first 2 years of our life. You know, as a baby cries because its needs are not met, if those needs, if the parents are not very caring, the baby's needs are not met, and the baby forms a subconscious belief that you know, it's not a safe world because my needs are not being met. Whereas if the baby learns when it's hungry or damp and its nappy needs to be changing, the parents respond, the baby learns that the world around it takes care of its needs. So throughout this first 24 years, we learn a whole set of beliefs, and so in those nations or communities where people are not well cared for, then we will find that they operate from the lower stages of psychological development and from the lower worldview. So how do we move forward? Well, education, travel are fundamentally important. And living in a democratic country where you are free to individuate and self-actualize, like in the former USSR, if you started to express your values, express who you are, you were locked up and sent to Siberia. The same thing happens in North Korea right now. You know, people can't individuate in these countries. That's what the Arab Spring was about. In Egypt and Tunisia, a certain mass of population in the late 20s and early 30s managed to satisfy their survival, safety, and relationship and recognition needs, and now they're wanting to individuate. They had good jobs, but they came up against a regime that was holding them back, and so they demonstrated. So it can be very slow, this process, but it is a process.
Yeah, I get it, and it makes me think also that I'm guessing we choose leaders, obviously, based on those who resonate with our own worldviews the most, and in our own.
Yes, of course.
Right.
We choose. If you're in a democratic country, then the leaders represent the average level of consciousness of the nation. The people you elect represent the average level of consciousness of the nation. So, you know, that says something about the USA. It also says something about the UK, by the way. Because there are large numbers of people in the USA and the UK who both countries were operating from world awareness, where the focus is on making money, and the leaders were all in focusing on making money. Nobody cared about the poor really very much, and so those who didn't get a higher education got left behind, and those people. More and more inequality grew in USA and UK, and so you have it built up to the point where there was more than half the population that said, look, you know, this isn't good enough, and they voted in Donald Trump and they voted Brexit.
Well, that leads to a question that I think maybe you can kick off into the next presentation. Somebody was asking about what's the best way to address worldview of power, profit, and consumption. And so rather than address it now, do you want to kick back into the presentation?
Yeah, I want to kick back, and I'm going to describe the worldviews, and let's pick that question up when we get through that next piece. Okay?
Sounds great.
Thank you. So here we go. Let's talk about the evolution of worldviews, because, you know, if we look back over 10,000 years, we can actually see the evolution of worldviews. Worldview, as we said, is a set of beliefs that enables you to interpret or give meaning to what's happening. And based on that meaning we make a decision which we believe will enable us to get our needs met within that physical and cultural framework of our existence. The worldviews that people use to interpret what is happening to them are determined by their sense of identity. I can't stress this enough. your sense of identity determines your worldview. So if we go back 10,000 years, most people were hunter-gatherers, and they survived through sharing and reciprocity. And people, nowadays, you find this in a few places on the planet, but I'll explain that in a moment. But people live in small family groups and survive by hunting and gathering. They regard their physical environment as their home. The earth is their mother. The world they live in is their classroom, and nature is their teacher. Men and women participate equally in making decisions. There's a common understanding about the spheres of activity of men and women. There are no formal rules. There are common understandings about how people should be treated, and behaviors are controlled through social pressure. So this is what we call clan awareness. Clan awareness can still be found in the Aboriginal people and also the people living in the remote parts of Amazon and Papua New Guinea. Now, clan awareness shifted into tribal awareness when nomadic hunter-gatherers settled in one place in a village and in small towns and started horticulture and farming. There was a plentiful supply of food, which caused the clans to expand into tribes. So tribes, they focus on safety through belonging and loyalty. So blood ties and family are very important in the tribe awareness. Many aspects of this worldview show up in our modern world in the form of dress codes, rituals, superstitions, and sports teams. You know, the other day, Manchester City, the football team, played Manchester United, and you know, in that stadium, there were these two sets of fans, and they were very tribal in their loyalty. You also find this sometimes in family-run businesses, where outsiders can't be trusted. So men and women participate in decision-making. What belongs to you belongs to the tribe, belongs to the family, and there's an active suppression of the ego. You know, people with tall poppies get their heads cut off, let's put it that way. So the ego is suppressed, and separation shows up in the form of ethnicity, ethnic identity, and territoriality, and also in terms of rituals and dress codes. So you can find this tribe awareness in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and in the indigenous groups of North and South America, also in the Caribbean. Tribe awareness shifted into state awareness around 3000 BC, when tribes began to expand from towns into cities, and city-states started forming. And there was a competition for resources and territory. The more territory you had, the more resources you had. And so this led to state awareness, security through power and strength. What happened here was basically the male ego got liberated, and we haven't put it back in the box yet. It's still out there. Women are not respected in this worldview. They tend to be treated as sexual objects. Homophobia is rampant. LGBT not tolerated. And leaders operating from state awareness will lie, cheat, and manipulate to get what they want. They often have a series of trophy wives to whom they are seldom faithful. They take pride in displays of military strength and physical and sexual accomplishment. I was thinking about this the other day when I heard that Donald Trump wants to start military parades in Washington again. And of course, we all know the recent scandals with regard to his sexual accomplishment. So there is a sense in which this is part of Donald Trump's worldview. It's also a worldview of dictators and those who use fear to manipulate others to gain power. For example, mafia, drug lords, unscrupulous politicians. So nations where the worldview of state awareness is dominant include these. Now, here I'm moving into a new subject, really. Here are these numbers in front of the countries represent what I call the Global Consciousness Index. So I've mapped the consciousness of 145 nations, and Hong Kong is number 33. It's at the top of nation awareness, ready to move into the next level, which is going to be world awareness. Now, Russia ranks 101. Afghanistan ranks 145. It's the bottom of the list. Countries like Turkey and China are 91 and 92. So this is a ranking of consciousness, which is linked now to worldviews. So after state awareness, we moved into nation awareness. in Roman and Greek times, there was state awareness. They became absolutely unmanageable. The leaders had to look around, make sure they weren't being stabbed in the back, and it was basically chaos and disorder. And the only way you could create order was through power. Everyone suffered, basically. And so nation awareness, which began really around the 5th century AD, when the Roman Empire began to move from many gods to one god, to monotheism, and to the Christian way of being, that brought order to the system. Now, in nation awareness, law and order are strongly emphasized. So in nation awareness, this is security through authority and religion. So in some countries, you'll find strong police states, and in other countries, you'll find very strong religion, not necessarily Christianity. It could be Islam. It could be other religions. The worldview associated with nation awareness tends to be found in these nations. There are strict laws and rules of conduct, sometimes moral authority. So, for example, the Taliban, absolute moral authority. Elites dominate. Citizens are divided into upper, middle, and lower classes. Women are regarded as second-class citizens with very few rights. Leaders regard themselves as the ultimate authority, and there's only one right way, and it's their right way. Here you see pictures of the Hitler regime and the Ku Klux Klan. Leaders influence and meddle with affairs of state and the justice system. The union of marriage of men and women from different ethnic or religious groups is frowned upon. Want to maintain pure ethnicity. Now, nations where the worldview of nation awareness is dominant include all of these. You see at top of this list, which is USA. It just moved down from world awareness into nation awareness. This is also shows up in the Economic Intelligence Unit's democracy index. It downgraded USA democracy from a full democracy into a partial democracy. Now, some of these other countries below, Slovenia, Singapore, and France, are actually moving up towards world awareness. Now, if you look at the other end of this scale, Italy, Cyprus, Mauritius, and Poland, they operate from nation awareness, but they're actually tending to move down slightly into state awareness, or they've just recently moved up from state awareness into nation awareness. Now, nation awareness transitioned into world awareness when nations opened their doors to people from other nations, accepted and integrated people with different ethnicities, religions, and became democratic, replaced monarchs and religious leaders with elected members of communities. So in world awareness, this is security through wealth and science. The cosmology here is, as I said, science, no God. Evolution is just simply random mutations. So in this worldview, governance structures are much more democratic. The women, although still discriminated against, have much more control of their lives. They get the vote. You know, that happened about a century ago in a few in European nations and some Anglo-Saxon nations. Religious and ethnic diversity are much more acceptable and tolerated. However, the rich and powerful try to influence political decision-making through bribery and corruption, and this is, somewhat rampant in the USA and to a certain extent in the UK. The poor and the disadvantaged, as well as the environment, are disregarded. Making money is paramount. People get left behind. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer because the people with wealth invested at a high rate of return, whereas the people who don't have wealth and only have the people who, I don't know whether you can see that on my screen, but something just happened. Anyhow, so the people with wealth invested at a higher rate of return than the rise in income levels. So people who don't have wealth have to rely on their income, but incomes increase very slowly, whereas wealth increase much faster. So the gap between the rich and poor and inequality increases. Now, nations where the worldview of world awareness are dominant are Canada, Australia. You see them right here. I think UK is heading down towards nation awareness. Canada is definitely heading up towards people awareness, the next stage. The big issue in Canada, what's holding Canada back is basically gender equality. It doesn't score very highly in that particular domain, and Trudeau is trying to change that. So world awareness provided people with opportunities to meet their survival, safety and security needs. That was a good thing. And democratic countries, so that people were free to individuate if they wanted to. And so this has led to an acceleration in the development of worldviews and opportunities for psychological development. So world awareness transitioned into people awareness when people were given the freedom to be who they are, to worship whatever religion they chose, and when values replaced beliefs as a principal mode of decision-making, because beliefs separate, values unite people. So freedom through equality and fairness, that's people awareness. Nations operating from worldview people awareness tend to be governed by coalitions, not by two-party states, which reflects all the diverse priorities of citizens. Men and women are treated equally, people with different sexual orientations are accepted, and different religions are accepted. There's no discrimination, basically. Everyone's voice and everyone's aspirations are considered important. Conflicts are avoided, and decisions are made by consensus. That can be a problem. But dialogue is considered important before reaching a decision. And the people, and in people awareness, have the cosmology of spirituality. So what nations are operating like this? Well, here are the top 7 conscious nations in the planet. Finland, Norway, and Denmark are number 1, 2, and 3. And but that's not the end. There are no people awareness will transition into humanity awareness, but there are no nations operating from humanity awareness. But there are people who are operating from humanity awareness. Now, what would humanity awareness look like? When we identify with humanity, we will care for humanity. So this is about finding meaning through self-expression and creativity. It's the first worldview that is truly systemic and integral in nature. It will take decision-making to a new level. It looks at the big picture, considers the whole rather than the parts. It's like this is a worldview where you might begin to see world governance or structures that enable world governance to take place. There are no identity barriers in this worldview because everybody is regarded as a soul, basically having a human experience, and all souls are equal and connected. So they see, in humanity awareness, they see other worldviews not as competing belief structures, but through the lens of different value priorities. As I already said, we move now beyond spirituality into soul consciousness. Soul consciousness actually pulls together the idea of science, religion, and psychology into a unifying belief system based on energy. So what lies beyond humanity awareness? Now, there's a few odd people in the world, not odd in the sense of strange, well, maybe they are strange to some people, but there are people operating from earth awareness and unity awareness. Earth awareness is about making difference through connection and empathy. People connect and collaborate with all humans for the purpose of nurturing humanity and safeguarding our physical home, the planet. We become a tribe of souls, deeply connected and caring for the energy field of the earth, which nurtures our existence. And then we move beyond that into unity awareness, service through contribution and compassion. We recognize the undifferentiated wholeness of our energetic existence. We are the co-creators of the universe, and our collective beliefs create our collective reality. A complete absence of any form of separation. So there you have the different worldviews, and this is when they began to appear. Now, clan awareness is you can still find, tribe awareness you can still find, but this is the time when they first began to appear. And so we will see, I believe, humanity awareness is already evolving, and we see a little bit of earth awareness in certain individuals. And more people are actually moving beyond spirituality into soul consciousness. So we could see humanity awareness, maybe one or two nations or communities operating from humanity awareness in this century. These represent the stages of psychological development. So each worldview corresponds to a stage of psychological development at a personal level. I covered this stages of development in my first two webinars on the values in my personal life and values in our organizations. And so here you get this link between the worldview and the stages of psychological development. So let's pause there for a moment before we move into the final set of the presentation, Margaret, and take a few more questions.
That's great, Richard. I'm listening and I'm riveted at the same time. So let's come back to that question that was kind of posed before. How can we address the worldview of power, profit, and consumption? What are some of the strategies and things we can do?
Right. Well, you know, it all begins with you. You know, that's the point. What is your worldview, and are you operating from world awareness? Are you operating from state awareness? Are you operating from nation awareness? You need to be able to figure out what your worldview is and how then you change. And so it's a personal journey. It's a personal journey through the stages of psychological development. And so, you know, one of the ways we can do this is we can change our whole education system. So not to teach kids how to operate in the worldview of world awareness, which is all about making money, but help them to change the education system so kids learn how to fully express who they are, learn how to connect with other people so they can make a difference, and learn how to contribute to other people. And so it fundamentally begins with education. However, if let's assume that we are in our 20s or 30s, then it begins by individuating. We have to let go of the fears that we learned, subconscious fears about not having enough, not being loved enough, and not being enough. So we have to work on ourselves again there in order to move through the individuating stage. And that applies to anybody who hasn't really focused on their psychological development. So ultimately, you know, it begins with you. Now, the question is, how do we do it at a community level? Well, you know, one of the ways of doing it is to map the values of your community or your nation. And, you know, we mapped the values of 27 nations of our value center. And so we, and in some nations, in Sweden and France, we've done it many years running. And so we're able to follow the evolution of consciousness in those nations. We could do the same in communities too. And so we can begin community dialogues. This is what happened in Iceland way back in 2008. It was August, and we were doing a national values assessment of Iceland, and the results came in, and we had very, very high levels of cultural entropy. I couldn't believe it because, you know, Iceland is a very democratic country. In fact, it's the most democratic country on the planet. And I realized that what was happening there, here was a country that was operating from people awareness, but the leadership were actually not operating from, they were operating from a lower level of, a lower worldview. And so they were operating from the worldview of world awareness when most of the people are operating from the people awareness. And this created the cultural entropy in Iceland and began a discussion. After that, when Iceland went bankrupt in 2008, they began a discussion, a dialogue of involving all the people of Iceland to change their constitution. So here is an example of a country that, you know, consciously began to suppress this world awareness and move back into people awareness where they were before, when all the leaders and the economists got control and tried to drag that nation back down into world awareness from people awareness.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating to see how that can happen based on how people are relating to all of this and how and that evolutionary work that happens inside ourselves. Somebody's asked, could you repeat how you define soul consciousness?
Oh, yes. It's my favorite topic. I've written a lot about it. New Psychology of Being. I wrote a New Psychology of Well-Being. I wrote that book to bring soul back into psychology. You know, I often, well, practically every webinar or seminar or workshop I do for the last 3 years, I ask people to stand up if a statement I make is true. And I say, I have a television, and people stand up, and then I say, I am a television. People don't stand up. And then I say, I have an ego, and people stand up. And then I say, I am an ego, and some people stand up. And then I say, I have a soul. Nearly everybody stands up. And then I say, I am a soul, and everybody stays standing. And I say to them, well, wow, you're really confused. You don't know whether you have a soul or you are a soul. Well, the truth for me is that we don't have a soul. We are souls. And that's a fundamental difference in understanding who we are. I also explain this in my book, What My Soul Told Me, a practical guide to soul activation. So soul awareness is energetic awareness. It's an awareness of who you are. The soul incarnates into this three-dimensional material reality, and the three-dimensional materiality we live in is a property of our perception, our physical, our eyes, our ears, etc. It's not a property of the world. The world is an energetic world. We live in this, the material world is contained within this energetic world, and that's the world of the soul. And when you realize who you really are and embrace soul awareness, everything changes. I used to have a mission and a vision for my life, and now I no longer, for several years, I don't have that. My only mission now is to be the servant of my soul, because I realize the soul is actually, that's who I am. And when you realize that and trust your soul, everything works out for you. When things are not quite working for me, I will just, before I go to bed at night, I'll say to my soul, who's talking to my soul? It's my ego, in a sense, that's talking to my soul. I say, soul, I need you to show up because things aren't working. And, you know, bet your bottom dollar next day something happens which moves the situation forward in a positive direction. So I've written a lot about that. I refer you to those books, and I really can't spend much more time on it in this particular seminar.
Yeah. But it sounds like we need another one on that alone, which is great.
Yeah.
Now, to get back to your presentation, and I know you're going to talk next about the Global Consciousness Index, and one of the questions that somebody's asked that we can park and come to is, which is the most conscious nation on the planet? So why don't we bring you back to your presentation?
Well, I indicated that already, but I'm going to go more into it. The most conscious nation on the planet right now is Finland, followed by Norway and Denmark. But anyhow, let's go dig deeper into that, and let me get off the screen so I can do it. Okay, here we go. Whoops, nope, there we go. So about a year ago, I decided to explore the possibility of developing a metric for the consciousness of nations. I call it Global Consciousness Indicator. I ranked 145 nations by consciousness level, and the way I did that was I took 17 global indicators and I allocated them to the 7 levels model. And so for each level of consciousness, there were 2 or 3 or 4 indicators. For example, at level 2, the relationship level, I used the peace index. So I had all of these different indicators, and I had to normalize the data because they're all on different scales. So I normalized the data to get them on the same scale, and then I added up, you know, the 2 or 3 indicators for each level, and then I added them, the scores up for all the 7 levels to get to a measurement of consciousness and a ranking of consciousness. So here are the different indicators that I used in order to calculate the index for particular levels of consciousness. So For example, at level 4, which deals with freedom and equality, I used the freedom index, levels of democracy by the Economic Intelligence Unit, etc., press freedom, etc., etc. So here you see a plot. This is very interesting. So these are the, on the left is the globalization index, and on the bottom is the global consciousness index scale. And so what you see on the, first of all, it's pretty much a straight line. And what you see on the right-hand side, the green are the countries operating from people awareness, and they have the highest level of globalization. Next come the orange, or it looks like yellow on my screen. These are the ones in world awareness, and you see there's a scale at the bottom. And then come the nation awareness, and then state awareness 1, state awareness 2, and state awareness 3. The ones in state awareness 3 are mostly, but not all, African nations. And so what this is very, very clear is that the as globalization index increases, consciousness increases. But I'd like to put it the other way around. I'd say as consciousness increases, globalization increases. So here's the results by region. So on the left, you have Australasia, 2 countries, Europe, 40 countries, Americas, 24 countries, and then the world, 145 countries. And you've got the scores for those regions for each level of consciousness, and on the right-hand side, you've got the total score and the average ranking. Now, what's fascinating to me is that at level 2, this is the relationship level. This is the strongest score in the whole world for that level of consciousness. Level 2 is the strongest score. So what that means is simply saying is that nations focus first of all on the safety and security of their citizens and reducing the level of violence. That's what nations focus on. Now, what is the least thing that nations focus on? I found this fascinating. The least priority is social cohesion, social progress with regard to integration of tolerance of people of different ethnicities, religions, or sexual orientation. It only scores 43.18. You see that at the bottom. It's quite a high score in Australasia, in New Zealand, and Australia, where people of all of these different ethnicities, etc., are accepted. But in most other, it's not well accepted. Even in Europe, where we've got 40 countries, you know, the score there is only 56.5 at level 5, and the average score in the world is 43.18. So that's the major problem in the world, is integration of people who don't look like me, who don't have the same religion as me, and don't have the same sexual orientation as me. That's the biggest issue in terms of consciousness on the planet right now. And this conclusion aligns with the values of humanity, which I discussed in the previous seminar in this series, where we looked at the values of 500,000 people, and people focus, first of all, on their level 2 values, and then once those are in place, then they will only focus on level 5 values. So what are the 10 most conscious nations? Well, Finland, and these are their scores also. There you've got them, the 10 most conscious nations. Now, interestingly, the top 5 also are the most happiest. So here's the happiness index recently published against global consciousness indicator. You can see it's a pretty much of a straight line. So there's a strong link between consciousness and happiness. And here you see the 10 most happy countries are exactly the same as the 10 most conscious countries. Netherlands pops in number 6 in happiness, whereas Luxembourg pops in at number 10 in consciousness. So there's a really strong correlation between the level of consciousness, stage of psychological development, the average stage of psychological development of a nation, and the level of happiness in that nation. Now here are the rankings for Europe, okay? And these are countries that operate from people awareness, okay? These are the highest ranking nations in Europe. Here's the next set of ranking nations, and they are operating from world awareness. And the next set of ranking nations are operating from nation awareness. I find it interesting that most of these nations are Catholic, whereas most of these nations are Protestant. I haven't looked into that, but it's just interesting. And then we'll look at the nations operating from state awareness, and they're mostly Eastern Europe. So the question I've been putting to myself is, how unified is the European Union? Because these are all countries from, I think they're all countries from the European Union, but most of them are anyhow. So here you've got those nations operating from people awareness in green, you've got the world awareness in orange, you've got the nation awareness in blue, and you've got various stages of state awareness in red. So how unified is the European Union? Not very unified. And it's actually, you know, this is a big issue, and it's becoming an increasing issue as these red states are beginning to become deeper and deeper into state awareness and are discriminating against foreigners. I mean, look what happened this week in Hungary. You know, the president of Hungary was elected for the third time, and you know, he's been called a racist. I didn't call him a racist, but he's been called a racist in the United Nations, and he's basically, you know, doesn't want any foreigners, and he definitely doesn't want any immigrants in Hungary. So here's the Atlas of Worldviews, which are actually all the nations, 145 nations on the planet, nations which I got data for. And so the green ones are in people awareness, the world awareness, nation awareness, state awareness 1, state awareness 2, and state awareness 3. So interestingly, Mongolia is state awareness 1. That really stands out, whereas state awareness 2 is Russia and all of China, etc. Australia is in world awareness and moving up to people awareness. New Zealand's already in people awareness. Big difference between Canada and the US. What lets the US down is the fact that it ranks about 68 at level 2 consciousness, which is relationship level, whereas it ranks overall about number 18. So basically, the United States is one of the most unsafe democratic nations, democratic Western nations on the planet. Very different to Canada. Canada's problem is slightly different. I hinted at it earlier. It's really at level 4 consciousness because Canada doesn't do very well in terms of gender equality, and Trudeau is trying to do something about that. So moving on, now we get into towards the end, actually, the end of the seminar, and we'll go back into any questions, Margaret, or comments.
That's great. Well, one comment, I was looking at your map, I think, does the Gulf Stream have anything to do with the rise of people awareness? I'm kind of joking, but it's certainly tempting. I want to swim in those waters.
Okay. No, actually, if you want to know what the people awareness is about, I've just began to understand why people awareness is so strong in these Scandinavian nations, because they have a philosophy of that they teach everybody when growing up, and it's basically you shouldn't stand out above other people. You shouldn't try to gain all the attention. It's a bit like tribal awareness, but in a more sophisticated, and there is a particular name for that, and it's not much talked about. But actually, all the Scandinavian nations bring up their children in that way, and I'm beginning to understand that is why they're able to operate from people awareness. You have to watch this space because I have to write the article on that yet, but I think I've really found the answer as to why these nations are have such an elevated consciousness.
That's fantastic. Well, thinking about concrete steps, like what is one concrete step that we as individuals and leaders could take to help address the issue of inclusion and the lack of acceptance? Because that seems like it really influences being able to get to people awareness.
Yeah. Okay. So nations move up by stages. So If I go into a nation operating from state awareness and say, how do you get to people awareness, they'll laugh at me. I'll be thrown out. To move from state awareness, you have to move into nation awareness. To move from nation awareness, countries operating from nation awareness move up to world awareness. So the question, like, how do we move into people awareness, should really be addressed to nations operating from world awareness. And so in answer to that, the nations operating world awareness, how do they get to people awareness? Well, they focus on equality. That's the, particularly income equality, because people get left behind, and when they get left behind, they become self-interested, and when other people from other nations come into their nation and seemingly take their jobs, they get very angry. And so, you have to look at this step by step. So in Hungary, for example, which is really operating from state awareness, the question would be, how do you move it into nation awareness? And so there's not one fixed answer. You've got, basically, as I said earlier, people in the nation have to learn how to move to a higher stage of psychological development, and the average will then increase, and that will change the worldview of the nation.
Fantastic. Terrific. I think I've got time for one more question before we have to wrap up. I know you mentor people of all ages. Are you seeing a difference in the consciousness in emerging leaders in a younger generation these days?
Okay, so the answer is yes, and I'm particularly seeing it in the I'm coming across it. Okay, I think that's a better way to put it. In the late 20s and early 30s group, there's this. More and more, I'm coming across people who truly get that they're operating from soul awareness. They're still at the individuating stage of conscious of development. They're still at the self-actualization stage of development, but they are approaching life from not from a spiritual perspective, but some of them are, but they're moving up into soul awareness. I'm having young people who buy my books, A New Psychology of Human Well-Being and What My Soul Told Me, A Practical Guide to Soul Activation. I'm having these young people call me and say, I need your help, or I would like to talk to you, because they've got questions. And I've actually been mentoring a few of these people, and they are absolutely amazing young people. You could say they're wanting to make a difference, so maybe that they're at the integrating stage, the sixth stage, but they're not at that stage, because they're approaching making a difference from the point of view of ambition and being recognized and wanting to right wrongs. Whereas at the integrating stage in your 50s, you approach making a difference from the perspective of empathy.
Gotcha.
So they're still following the stages of development, but they're very focused on making a difference, but they're making a difference from the needs of the stage of development they're at.
Gotcha. Well, that gives me hope, as the next generation.
Come on, Margaret.
Let's wrap up. I'll remember the country I'm living in right now, and who we're dealing with, and the challenges that we have.
No, my heart goes out to you.
Thank you. I thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and for Richard for sharing some of what you've learned on this 30-year journey to help us understand the importance of values and how that also influences everything related to society and the advancement around the world. And so thank you, each and every one of you. I look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Have a great day.